This is the story of Tobias Reed and his wife Evelyn Reed. They had built something that looked from the outside like a good life. A renovated craftsman house in a quiet Portland neighborhood. 2 reliable cars in the driveway. Dinner parties where the wine was always decent and the conversation never quite reached anything real. Tobias was the kind of man who measured love in logistics, the mortgage paid on time, the vacations planned, the problem solved before they could be felt. Evelyn was the kind of woman who had learned, long before she met him, to make herself smaller in rooms where she wasn't sure she was wanted. What neither of them understood, not for years, and perhaps not until it was far too late, was that a marriage can be maintained with great discipline and still be slowly, quietly starved. The tension between them was not the loud kind. It was the kind that lives in the pauses between sentences, in the way one person stops reaching and the other stops noticing. The coffee was always made by the time Tobias came downstairs. This was not an arrangement they had discussed. It had simply become true, the way many things in their marriage had become true through repetition rather than intention. Evelyn would wake at 6:15, move through the kitchen in the gray morning light, and by the time she heard the pipes groan upstairs as he showered, the French press was already steeping on the counter. She didn't mind it exactly. That was the complicated part. She didn't mind most of it, most of the time, which made it difficult to explain, even to herself. The particular weight she carried through each ordinary day. Tobias came down at 6:40, dressed for work, and poured himself a cup without looking at the press. "You're going to the Hendersons' thing tonight?" he asked, scrolling through something on his phone. "Their daughter's recital." "Yes." She was at the sink, rinsing her own cup. "I mentioned it Wednesday." Right, he wasn't disagreeing, he was simply filing it. They had been married 11 years. Long enough that their conversations had developed a kind of shorthand that sometimes felt like efficiency and sometimes felt like erosion. Tobias was 43, a project manager at a civil engineering firm, a man whose competence was genuine and whose emotional vocabulary had never quite caught up to it. He was not cruel. That was important to understand. He was not calculating or cold in the way that requires intent. He was, more precisely, a man who had learned to treat his interior life as largely irrelevant to the business of living, and who had, without meaning to, applied that same principle to his wife's. Evelyn was 39. She had a part-time position doing grants coordination for a nonprofit arts collective. Work she found meaningful in ways she rarely articulated, because Tobias had a gentle but consistent way of making her feel that anything not generating serious income was more hobby than career. He would have denied this if confronted. He would have been genuinely confused by the accusation. And yet, she had a quality that people often describe as composure, but which was, more accurately, practice. She had grown up learning to read rooms, to sense when her presence was welcome and when it was merely tolerated, and she had become so skilled at this that she could modulate herself in real time, adjusting her volume, her warmth, the amount of space she took up. Around Tobias, over the years, she had gradually taken up less and less. It was around this time that she had begun having lunch, occasionally, with a colleague named Petra, who worked 2 floors up at the nonprofit's shared building. Petra was 51, recently widowed, and had the specific kind of directness that comes from having survived real loss. She didn't fill silence. She didn't perform interest. She didn't feel. Evelyn found this both frightening and deeply restful. "You look tired," Petra said one afternoon in November, setting down her fork. "I slept fine." "That's not what I said." Evelyn looked at her salad. Outside the window, the street was wet, the sky the particular white of a Pacific Northwest winter that never quite commits to either rain or clearing. "I'm okay," she said. Petra didn't push. That was one of the things about her. She offered the observation and then let it sit, let the other person do with it what they would. Evelyn carried the moment home with her and set it on the counter beside the French press and tried not to think about it too carefully. That evening, after the recital, Tobias was still awake when she got home, which was unusual. He was on the couch with his laptop, a spreadsheet open, and he looked up when she came in with an expression that was almost attentive. "How was it?" "Sweet," she said. She's only 7. She forgot the second verse and just stopped, and then looked at her mother in the front row and kept going. He smiled at that. A real smile, small and unguarded, and for a moment, just a moment, she remembered why she had loved him. The problem was that the moment passed the way they always did now, quickly, and without either of them knowing what to do with it. She went upstairs. He returned to his spreadsheet. The house settled around them both. By February, Evelyn had stopped mentioning things, not deliberately, not with any conscious decision. It was more that she had begun to notice, with the quiet precision of someone who has been paying attention for a long time, the exact moment in each conversation when Tobias's focus would migrate elsewhere, a slight shift in his posture, the way his eyes moved toward his phone or toward the middle distance. It lasted only a second or two, and she was certain he didn't know he did it, but she had learned to read it the way a sailor reads wind, not because the information was useful anymore, but because the habit of reading it had become automatic. So she stopped finishing certain sentences, stopped starting others. There was a Saturday in late February when they were both home, a rarity, and the house had that particular weekend quiet that should have felt companionable and didn't quite. Tobias was organizing the garage, which he did periodically with the focused intensity he brought to all physical tasks. Evelyn was in the kitchen, attempting a roulade she'd seen in a cooking video, not because it was practical, but because she wanted to do something that required her complete attention. "You need help in here," he called from the garage. "I'm all right." He appeared in the doorway anyway, hands on his hips, surveying the kitchen with the mild concern of a man who has found a situation slightly more complicated than expected. "What is that?" "It's going to be a chocolate hazelnut roulade." "Going to be?" "It's not there yet." He watched her for a moment, the bowl, the folded egg whites, the concentration on her face, and she felt the familiar dual awareness. Glad he was there, uncertain what to do with his presence. He came and stood beside her, looked into the bowl and said, "Smells good," which was generous given that it smelled primarily of sugar and effort. "You can go back to the garage," she said, not unkindly. "I know." But he didn't, for a few minutes. He leaned against the counter and watched her work, and something moved through the kitchen that was almost tenderness. "Almost that. Petra thinks I should take on a new project," she said without looking up. "A residency coordination thing. It would mean some travel." "How much travel?" "4 trips, maybe, over 6 months." He was quiet for a moment. "Is it paid?" There it was. Not malice, just the first question that occurred to him. "Yes," she said, "it's paid." "Then you should do it if you want." She nodded, folded the batter, and did not look at him. He pushed off the counter and went back to the garage. "I don't know," she thought, and then, strangely, the thought arrived as if meant for someone else, as if she were aware briefly of the strange intimacy of being perceived, of a story being told, maybe like this story or subscribe or something. She blinked. The thought dissolved as quickly as it had arrived, nonsensical. A brain static moment she couldn't explain, and she refocused on the bowl. Later, when the roulade had mostly worked and they ate it at the kitchen table, Tobias said, "This is actually really good," and she said, "I know," and they both almost laughed. And it was the best moment they'd had in months, and neither of them said so. In March, she called Arthur Voss. She hadn't spoken to her father in 6 years. The estrangement had not been dramatic. It had been a slow, mutual withdrawal following her mother's death, when it became clear that neither of them knew how to be family to each other without her mother acting as interpreter. Arthur Voss was 71, a private equity investor with a reputation for patience and an interior life he shared with almost no one. He had not been a warm father. He had been a present one, which was different. She didn't tell Tobias she'd called. There was nothing deceptive in this, or so she told herself. It simply wasn't yet anything she knew how to explain. The conversation happened on a Thursday evening in April, while the window above the kitchen sink showed the last gray light of a day that had never fully arrived. It had been building. She knew that now, looking back, the way things build underwater, invisible until they surface. What surfaced was not an affair, not a discovery, not a betrayal in any of the ways those words usually mean. What surfaced was simply the truth, which is often the most quietly devastating thing there is. Tobias had found the bank statement, not snooping. She wanted to be fair about that. He had been looking for the property tax documents and had opened the wrong drawer and found a statement from an account she'd opened 18 months ago in her name only, into which she had been directing a modest but consistent portion of her freelance income. He set it on the kitchen table when she came home. She looked at it. She looked at him. She took off her coat and hung it on the hook by the door and came back. "You've been keeping a separate account," he said. "Yes, for how long?" "A year and a half." He sat down, not heavily, not dramatically. Just sat, as if his legs had made a quiet decision. Why? This was the question she had thought about in abstract many times. The answer she had arrived at was neither satisfying nor simple. "Because I needed something that was mine," she said. "That's the most honest answer I have." "Something that was yours." He repeated it not as accusation, but as a phrase he was trying to understand, turning it over. "Everything here is ours," she said. "I know. I don't mean it as a complaint about ownership." "Then what do you mean?" She sat across from him. The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. "I mean that somewhere in the last few years I started to feel like I was here, present, but not particularly accounted for, not in a deliberate way on your part. I'm not saying this to be cruel." She paused. "I'm saying it because you asked." He looked at the statement. "You could have talked to me." "I tried, Tobias. I don't think you heard it." The thing about that moment, the thing that surprised her, was that he didn't argue. He sat with it, which was not something she had expected from him. And for a moment she saw something in his face that looked like the beginning of understanding, which was perhaps worse than defensiveness would have been, because it meant that understanding had been possible all along, and they had arrived at it here, at this particular moment, which may have been too late. "Is there someone else?" he asked. "No. Do you want to leave?" She looked at her hands. "I don't know what I want. That's a real answer, not an evasion." He nodded slowly. Outside, a car passed, its headlights sweeping briefly across the wall. "I don't know how to do this," he said, meaning the conversation, or perhaps the marriage, or perhaps both. "I know," she said. "I know you don't." The divorce was his idea, though he would not have framed it that way. What he said 3 weeks later, after they had been moving through the house like two weather systems that had agreed not to collide, was, "Maybe we should figure out what we actually want here, separately." And she had understood that to mean he needed to be the one to leave the situation, not to be left, because he was a man who required the dignity of agency, even when the situation had already made the decision for him. She said, "Okay." He said, "I'll call the lawyer." She said, "Okay." And that was how it ended. Not with a fight, but with two people arriving at the same door from different directions. The papers were filed in June. They were signed in August. Evelyn kept the house. This surprised people who knew them, which Tobias felt, though he didn't say. He had imagined, in the abstract way men sometimes imagine their own divorces, that there would be a clear accounting, assets divided, practicalities resolved. The whole thing concluded with the brisk efficiency of a project reaching completion. What he had not imagined was that Evelyn would have, already, spoken to a lawyer of her own, a very good one, recommended by Arthur Voss, whose involvement in his daughter's life had quietly resumed in the 6 months before the papers were filed. Tobias did not know about Arthur Voss. Not at first. He knew Evelyn's father existed in the abstract. She had mentioned him rarely, and the estrangement had always seemed to Tobias like one of those old wounds that people carry without wanting to examine. He had not pressed. He had not, in truth, been particularly curious about the deeper geography of his wife's interior life, which was one of the more painful things he would come to understand about himself in the months that followed. He rented an apartment in the Pearl District. It had large windows and very little furniture, and he moved through it in the evenings with the specific purposelessness of a man who has always defined himself by competence and has temporarily run out of things to competently manage. He cooked simple meals. He called his brother in Denver twice. He did not call Evelyn because she had not called him, and he was not sure what the absence meant, but was not ready to find out. At work, a colleague named Davis, well-meaning, recently divorced himself, told him over lunch that Tobias was better off, that he'd land on his feet, that these things happen for a reason. Tobias nodded at each of these. He did not believe any of them, but he understood they were being offered as a form of kindness, and he had always been good at accepting kindness graciously while feeling nothing from it. What he felt mostly was a confusion that he kept mistaking for clarity. He told himself, in the clean narrative men sometimes construct from the wreckage of their choices, that Evelyn had been pulling away for years, that the separate account was evidence of something planned, something deliberate and cold. He built this version carefully, not because it was true, but because it was bearable. Then, in October, he saw the photograph. It was in the business section of a regional publication, a small item about a venture capital announcement, accompanied by a photo of Arthur Voss at a podium, his hand on the shoulder of a woman standing beside him. The caption read, Arthur Voss with his daughter Evelyn Voss Reed, Director of Philanthropic Initiatives at the newly established Reed Voss Foundation. Tobias read the caption twice. He had not known her father was Arthur Voss. He had not known Arthur Voss's name was something that appeared in business sections. He sat with this information for a long time in his sparsely furnished apartment and felt to rearrange certain things. He thought about the lawyers she'd retained. He thought about the house. He thought about the discovery, which had come from Evelyn's own legal team rather than theirs jointly, that two of the subcontractors he'd billed through a side LLC, a creative accounting approach he'd used for years and told himself was a gray area, had been flagged in a financial review. The review had been conducted by a firm Tobias did not recognize. He recognized it now. He was not ruined by this. That was important to understand. There was no single devastating blow. There was instead a careful, methodical audit that found what it found and reported it to the appropriate parties. Tobias would spend the better part of the following year resolving it. Back taxes, amended filings, professional censure that was significant without being catastrophic. What stayed with him, sitting in his living room with the magazine open on his lap, was not rage. It was something quieter, the understanding that there had been, inside his marriage, an entire dimension he had never thought to look at. That Evelyn, composed, accommodating, small space-taking Evelyn, had known things about herself, her resources, her history, that she had never offered him because he had never asked. He had not asked. He set the magazine on the coffee table. He looked at the window, at the Portland night, at the lights of the city doing what city lights do. He had not asked. They met in December at her request. She had texted, brief, practical, to say there were a few remaining administrative matters related to the house, and would he be available Thursday? He had said yes. She suggested the coffee place on Burnside that they'd gone to occasionally during better years, which he understood to mean she was trying to make this bearable rather than strategic. She was already there when he arrived. She had a pot of tea and had ordered him a black coffee without being asked, which undid something small in his chest. She looked well. He noticed this and tried to determine what it meant. Not the vindication of it, not the sting, but just the fact. She looked like someone who had, in the past several months, remembered something about themselves. Her posture was different. She took up more space. The title transfer is done, she said after they'd settled. The last document was the insurance rider. I just need your signature on one more thing. I brought a pen. She smiled almost. Of course you did. She slid the paper across. He read it. He always read things and signed where indicated. She folded it, put it in her bag. There was a pause. Outside, a woman with a stroller navigated past the window, struggling with the wheel on the uneven pavement, managing it. They both watched. I saw the piece about the foundation, he said. She looked at her tea. I figured you might. Why didn't you ever tell me about him? About who he was? She considered this for a moment, genuinely, not evasively. I think, she said slowly, I was afraid that if you knew, you'd relate to me differently, like through him, through his context. She looked up. I needed someone who would just see me. He felt that land. And I didn't, he said. It was not a question. You were trying to, she said, which was kinder than he deserved, and they both knew it. I think you tried in the way you knew how. I just needed something you didn't know how to give, and I didn't know how to ask for it, and we both waited too long for the other one to figure it out. She looked at her hands. That's not one person's fault. The audit, I didn't direct that, she said. My father's people found it independently. I won't pretend it was irrelevant to the settlement, but I didn't go looking for it. He nodded. He believed her. He wasn't sure whether that made it better or worse. Are you okay? She asked. The question surprised him, not the words, but the weight behind them, the genuine curiosity. She still wanted to know, or she had wanted to know for years and was asking it now because there was finally nothing at stake. I'm working on it, he said. I've been thinking about things I wasn't good at. Me too. I should have asked about your father. I should have told you. The coffee shop moved around them. A barista calling out a name, a couple at a corner table laughing at something on a phone, a child pressing their face against the cold glass from outside before being guided away. All of it ordinary and entirely indifferent to the two of them, which was, Tobias thought, a fair amount of mercy. He called you his princess, Tobias said. In the article, in the caption, something crossed her face, soft, old, complicated. He used to call me that when I was little, before everything got difficult. She paused. When we started talking again, he said it once and then got embarrassed, and I told him not to be, that I'd missed it. She looked at the window. Sometimes things are just what they are. He thought about this. He thought about the French press steeping on the counter at 6:30 in the morning. He thought about the Saturday with the roulade, the way she'd said, I know when he told her it was good, the almost love they'd shared. He thought about all the moments that had contained something retrievable and which he had passed through without stopping. He did not say any of this. She didn't need him to. And that too was a kind of conclusion. They walked out together into the December cold, and she turned one way and he turned another, and that was all. No final words that meant too much. No promises. Just two people who had been, for a time, each other's closest fact, separating into the ordinary afternoon. He stood at his car for a moment before getting in. He had not asked. He knew that now in a way that was settled and permanent, not as accusation, not as the kind of knowledge that allows for self-pity, but as a simple truth about who he had been inside that marriage, a man who had measured love in logistics and called it care, a man who had solved problems and mistaken that for presence. He got in the car. He sat for a moment in the quiet before starting the engine. Somewhere across the city he knew, Evelyn was walking back to a house that was hers, toward a life that she had been quietly building long before he'd thought to notice. He did not resent it. He was not sure he had the right to. He started the car. He pulled out into traffic. The city absorbed him without comment, the way cities do. It had not ended with a fight. It had not ended with a revelation. It had ended the way most real things end, not at the moment of breaking, but slowly, over years, in all the small silences where someone had tried to say something and no one had listened. And eventually the trying had simply, quietly stopped.